Today we are going to learn about what is the shoulder complex. So I hope that you all know what you mean by the shoulder. So basically it is called one of the main joint in our human body, or one of the joint which helping us to attain our normal functions or attain our daily activities. So shoulder is a joint, or shoulder is a region which is connecting our upper extremity to the chest cavity. So today we are going to learn about what is shoulder complex. So never get confused with the shoulder complex and shoulder joint. So shoulder joint is a specific term which uh, gives you an idea about a specific joint, but whereas shoulder complex is an umbrella term or a broad term under which many joints are coming. So all the joints which is present in the shoulder region or in the upper chest or upper arm region is comes under shoulder complex, whereas one of those joint is known as shoulder joint or glenohumeral joint. So we will be discussing about all those in coming slides. So first, what are these shoulder complex joints? So when we discuss about shoulder or shoulder joint, so there are multiple bones which are contributing to shoulder joint. First one is your scapula, then we have clavicle, then we have humerus. So these are the three primary bones which are uh, contributing contributing to this shoulder complex and the joints in shoulder complex. So there are different joints, so there are multiple joints which is formed by these three bones, and there are some functional joints, which means that some joint which is not actually presenting all the characteristics of a normal joint, but it act as a joint or it act as a pseudo joint in some situation. So what are the components in shoulder complex? So first one is sternoclavicular joint. So what do you mean by sternoclavicular? Just divide the name into two. It's a joint between sternum and clavicle bone. So as you can see in this picture, so this is your sternum and this is the manubrium of sternum. So the joint which is formed between this sternum and the clavicle is known as sternoclavicular joint. So next we have acromioclavicular joint. So as I said earlier, you can divide this term into two. So it's a joint which is forming between acromion and clavicular bone. So what do you mean by acromion? So acromion is known as a bony projection in the scapula. So we have a scapular bone. So there are multiple projections in scapular bone. So this first small thing is called as coracoid process. Just behind to that, there is one thing called as acromion process. So once this clavicle, the medial end of clavicle is get attached with the sternum, and the lateral end is getting attached with this acromion process of scapula. So there is a joint. So that's what called as acromioclavicular joint. So next is scapulothoracic joint. So as I said previously, there are some functional joints. Not the joint. It's a joint which is not presenting with the exact features of a regular joint, but it acts as a joint in some situation. So in other terms we call it as a pseudo joint. It's never gives you an exact feature of joints. So basically it's a joint between, so as I said, you can divide the name scapulothoracic. So it's a joint which is forming between our scapular bone and the thoracic region as a whole. So this is the scapulothoracic joint. So it's a pseudo joint. There is no, you cannot find any exact features of a joint in this scapulothoracic joint, but in some form it acts as a joint in some situation, so it be called as a functional joint. And the last one is known as glenohumeral joint, and this is the one joint which is known as shoulder joint. So as I said, we can divide this name glenohumeral. So it's a joint which is forming between glenoid fossa of the scapula. So this is the glenoid fossa, and glenoid fossa of the scapula with the head of humerus. So this is the glenohumeral joint. So these are the four joints which are uh, which are the components of shoulder joint. So first one is sternoclavicular joint, second one is acromioclavicular joint, third one is scapulothoracic joint, and the last one glenohumeral joint. So now we are going to discuss in detail about all of these four joints. First, what are the components in this shoulder complex? So as I said earlier, there are multiple bones which are contributing to the formation of this particular shoulder complex. So there are some osseous segments. The osseous segments are clavicle, scapula, and humerus. So these are the three bones, or these are the three osseous structure that is composing this shoulder region. And this all these three bones are interconnected or interlinked by some joints. As I said earlier, there are sternoclavicular joint, acromioclavicular joint, and clinohumeral joint. So these are the three exact joints which we can found in shoulder region. But there are some other joints, as I said earlier, as called as functional joints, such as scapulohumeral joints or subhumeral or subcoracoid joint. So these are other names for these functional regions. So we sometimes we consider it as a joint. As I said, there are some functional joints, that is scapulothoracic and subacromial or a suprahumeral. So these are the joints, or these are the components which is forming this shoulder region. So now you understood that with the help of these three bones, all our shoulder regions are connected. So one of the interesting fact about this upper limb is that the clavicle is the only bone which is getting attached with the skeleton of our body. So there is no other attachment to the skeletal as directly, but the clavicle is the one which is giving some kind of connection with the upper limb to the axial skeleton. So now you might have understood why we have this clavicle. So what's the importance of this clavicle? So whenever there is a fracture, whenever there is an injury to this clavicle, whole our upper limb functions may get disrupted. So that's the importance of this clavicle muscle, clavicle bone. So first we are going to looking about the first joint in the shoulder complex, which is sternoclavicular joint. So as I said, it's the joint between sternum or the head of sternum with the clavicle. So this is the only structural attachment of shoulder complex and upper extremity to the axial skeleton. So as I said, this is the only joint which is getting attached, which is helping your upper extremity to get attached with the axial skeleton. Next, what type of joint is this sternoclavicular joint? So it is a plain synovial joint. So there is no other particular features which is giving to this particular joint, but it is known as a plain synovial joint with 3 rotary and 3 translatory degrees of freedom. So I hope that you all know what is degree of freedom. So when we discuss about this sternoclavicular joint, it got 3 rotary and 3 translatory degrees of freedom. That means the sternoclavicular joint has 3, it is able to move, it is able to produce rotary movements in 3 planes, all 3 planes, and it is also able to produce the translator type of movement in all 3 planes. So this is one known as the degree of freedom. And as like in normal synovial joint, it got a synovial joint capsule, and it also got a joint disc, and it is surrounded by all 3 major ligaments. The rotations at sternoclavicular joint produce movement of both the clavicle and scapula under conditions of normal function, because the scapula is linked with the lateral end of clavicle at the acromioclavicular joint. So as I said earlier, the medial end of clavicle is attached to the manubrium or the sternum, and the lateral end is attached with the acromion process of scapula. So whenever there is a scapular movement, the clavicle may tend to move, and whenever there is a clavicular movement, then the scapula will also move in accordingly. So this is the features of a sternoclavicular joint. Now we need to discuss about what are the articulating surface of this sternoclavicular joint. So as I said earlier, you can divide the name sternoclavicular into 2. Then you will be able to understand what are the bones which is taking part in this particular joint. So there are 2 surfaces, 2 shallow saddle shaped surfaces, one at the medial end of clavicle and one at the notch formed by the manubrium of sternum and the first costal cartilage. So this is the sternum bone, and the head of sternum is known as manubrium. So there are two articulating surfaces. First one is medial end of clavicle. Second one is the superior notch of manubrium and the first rib. So these are the ribs. So your first rib is getting originated just below to this sternoclavicular joint. So this is the part which is contributing as a proximal at a proximal articulating surface of sternoclavicular joint, and the medial side of clavicle is acting as a distal articulating surface. The sternoclavicular joint is often classified as a plain synovial joint because the saddle shape of the articular surface is very saddle. So as I said, sternoclavicular joint is basically classified under the plain synovial joint because of there is just because there is no much more uh, optimal classification for this particular joint, even though there is a saddle shape, but the saddle shape can be extend from this particular situation because that shape does not plays an important role in this sternoclavicular joint. So the medial end of clavicle and the manubrium are incongruent with a little direct contact between the articulating surface. So as you can see in this picture, the medial end of clavicle and the manubrium are not in a very good shape to have a better attachment. So it is not getting contact with each other, but there are some portions which are getting attached with each other. So as I said, the sternum and clavicle is not getting attached with properly, but that's the situation when we need to have something in between these two articulated surface to produce the purposeful function by that particular joint. So the superior portion of the medial clavicle does not contact the manubrium at all, but serves as an attachment for the sternoclavicular joint disc and the interclavicular ligament. So as you can see in this picture, the clavicle and manubrium is not getting attached with each other, but both of these structures gives an attachment to the disc and the ligaments which are covering this sternoclavicular joint. So address the sternoclavicular joint space is wedge shape and open superiorly. Movements of the clavicle in relation to the manubrium result in changes to the area of contact between the clavicle, the sternoclavicular joint disc, and the manubriocostal cartilage. So in normal situations or in a resting position that there is no movements in joint, then what happens? This disc will be presented as a wedge shaped structure. But whenever we are trying to move the clavicle, so as you can see in this picture, this is in some abduction of the scapula. So whenever these movements are happening, then the normal there are some changes in the normal wedge shape to the disc. So what is sternoclavicular disc? So as I said, there are some structures which is sitting in between the sternum and the clavicle. So that's what called as sternoclavicular disc. So now we need to discuss about why we need a particular disc over there and what is the function of the disc. The sternoclavicular joint has a fibrocartilage disc, or it is also known as meniscus type structure, that increase the congruence between the articulating surface. So when we discussed about both clavicular and manubrium or the sternal articulating surface, one of the reason which we said to have an improper arrangement is the incongruence between the articulating surface. To avoid that incongruence, we have this articulating disc. So with the help of this disc, we are able to maintain a normal congruence of this particular joint or the articulating surface. The upper portion of sternoclavicular disc is attached with the posterior superior clavicle. So as you can see in this picture, the upper portion of the disc is getting attached with the posterior superior clavicle. So that means uh, in the clavicle bone, the middle head of clavicle, we have the middle head of clavicle bone. In the middle head of clavicle bone, the disc is getting attached to this behind and superior portion, or in the superior region. So that's the upper attachment of this disc. And same like that, we have lower portion is attached to the manubrium and first costal cartilage, as well as to the anterior and posterior aspect of fibrous sternoclavicular capsule. So these are the attachment of sternoclavicular disc. The disc transects the sternoclavicular joint space diagonally, dividing the joint into two separate cavities. During shoulder movements, the disc acts as a hinge or pivot point for medial end of clavicle. So as you can see in this picture, the disc is actually dividing the joint surface into two cavities. One is there in superior and one is there in inferior. It is dividing the joint cavity into two cavities, and whenever the shoulder joint is moving, then this particular point is acting as a pivot point. That means this is the point where the movements are rotating, or where the movements are actually having some axis of rotations with the shoulder joint. So during elevation and depression of clavicle, the medial articular surface rolls and slides on the relatively stationary disc, with the upper attachment of disc serving as a pivot point. During protraction, during elevation, that means whenever we are trying to lift our clavicle superiorly, and whenever we are trying to keep it as a inferiorly, then what happens? The articulating surface is actually rolling on the stationary disc. The clavicle will be rolling on a stationary disc. But whenever we are trying for protraction and retraction, means whenever we are trying to keep, whenever we are trying to protract, means whenever we are trying to take our upper arm into a shrugged shoulder position. So that's a protraction. So retraction means we are just opening our shoulder. So these are the protraction and retractions of the shoulder complex. So whenever we are trying for protraction and retraction of clavicle, the sternoclavicular disc and medial articular surface roll and slide together on manubrial facet, with the lower attachment of the disc serving as a pivot point. So in the differences in elevation and depression, what happens? The disc is actually as a stationary part, and the upper region of the disc is acting as a pivot point whenever we are trying for elevation and depression. And whenever we are trying for protraction and retraction, what happens? The whole disc is also getting moved with the clavicle bone. At that time, the lower end of the lower portion of the disc is actually acting as a pivot point. The disc therefore considered part of the manubrium during elevation and depression, and part of clavicle during protraction and retraction. So as I said, whenever we are trying for elevation and depression, the disc is actually getting attached with the manubrium or the head of sternum to produce that particular movement. And whenever we are trying for, that's the reason why we are having this upper part of disc as a pivot point. But whenever we are trying for protraction or retraction, what happens? The disc is getting detached from this manubrium and getting attached with the clavicle bone, and the lower end of the disc is acting as a pivot point. So this is how the disc is playing a role in the movements of sternoclavicular joint. The sternoclavicular disc provides stability by increasing joint congruence and by absorbing force transmitted along the clavicle from its lateral end to the sternoclavicular joint. So one of the reasons why we need to have a disc is to get a proper congruence of this particular joint. So whenever there is a normal, whenever we are asking for some stability from that particular joint, any of the joint should have a normal congruence. So the congruence is produced by the medial or the it is produced by the sternoclavicular disc.